This is not all the tech board, but it's a majority of us managed to make it over. I'll get all of you guys to introduce yourselves at the end, just before we start the panel discussion. I'll just start off by saying I'm Bruce Richardson. I'm just one of the members of this technical board, and I've been, or did, stupidly you may say, volunteer to do the intro to this group. So I've been involved in deep decay for quite a number of years. I work for Intel, for those of you who don't know me. So before we get into the Q&A, just some of the background on the technical board. So back in the early days of DBDK, back when the project started as an open source project back in 2013, there was no technical board. It was an entirely consensus-driven project, which worked pretty well, when you say, for the first year or two. The community wasn't huge. You were, towards the left side of the graph that Tim showed us just a couple of minutes ago. There weren't so many contributors. So you could actually reach consensus amongst the whole community. But this led to slower decision-making, especially as the community got bigger, and that then slowed down development. So we had cases where patches failed to get merged or failed to get any response because of lack of interest. And theoretically, patches could be blocked by a single objector because you wanted to reach consensus. So sometimes you had long discussions about whether something was good, bad, or just merely ugly, and certain patches never went anywhere. The really important stuff tended to get done, but it wasn't a particularly good situation. So we ended up a couple of years ago setting up a technical board to come to a decision when the community couldn't reach consensus, and to allow the project to move faster. Then, with the move to the Linux Foundation, this technical board got included in the DPDK project charter. It was one of two boards that are described in that charter. You've got the governing board, which is deals, as you see on the actual extract from the charter there, which deals with budget, marketing, lab resources, all these non-technical aspects, and then the technical board obviously deals with the more technical problems that the community faces. So, as it says at the end there, these two boards are peers and work together to oversee the DPDK project. That's the idea behind it, okay? So, what does that mean in practical day-to-day terms? It means that the technical board deals with inclusion of new stuff in DPDK primarily. So new functionality, new libraries, new drivers, and device classes particularly. So mainly libraries and device classes get discussed at the technical board and voted on for inclusion to have those brought into DPDK. A lot of times there isn't a huge amount of discussion about these on the list, so technical board just gets to make a decision. Technical board is not trying to overrule the community. We try to look for consensus in the community and take that community feedback before making a decision. Okay, so it's not just there to decide on its own what way the project is to be driven. We also take care of deciding whether new subtrees need to be created or staging trees for new functionality, and then who the committers are for these individual trees, approving any new sub-projects. Not that we've actually had to discuss that yet. Am I right in saying we've not yet had to discuss new sub-projects in DPDK? No? Not yet. But it is part of the scope of the technical board according to the charter. And then other times we get people actually sending requests to the technical board for input, just where there's not a lot of discussion happening on the mailing list about a patch set. They ask, well, will the technical board review this and just provide some feedback? And one or two of us then try to step in and give our opinions on it to help the community make progress, which is the main thing we're looking for here to keep driving the project forward. So overarching aim is kind of there at the bottom to help make technical decisions when consensus can't be reached on the list. If consensus is reached on the list, we'll generally rubber stamp that and the project moves forward. So the 9 current members are listed here. Not all of us are here today, as you see from the fact that we're not 9. So I'm Bruce. We've got the other guys. Do you want to introduce yourselves now, Stephen?
I'm Stephen Heminger from Microsoft. Actually, I worked out of Portland, Oregon, and which means I can go over and visit Intel really easily.
Yeah. Small little Intel site around there. Yes. Yeah.
I'm Hemant Agrawal. I work for NXP. I'm based out in India, Delhi.
I am Olivier Matt. I'm working at SixWin. I'm the maintainer of MBUF, Mempool, and Ring.
I'm Thomas Monjalon, DPDK maintainer, and I work at Mellanox. I'm Jerin, working for KVM, and currently maintaining ARM64 and the next event dev tree.
Yep, thanks, guys. So we're currently missing Konstantin, who hopefully will be around. And who else? Juan Han couldn't make it, and Jean Blanc are the other members. There's no one leader or chairperson of the technical board. We take it in turns to chair the meetings, provide the minutes, things like that. So there's no hierarchy. Though obviously Thomas is the boss, being the overall tree committer. But apart from that, we're all equal. So we share out the roles equally as much as is possible. So I just happen to be the volunteer to do this intro here today. Initially, we only held meetings whenever it proved necessary, whenever there was some major issue to discuss that it couldn't fail to reach consensus on the mailing list. In practice, I think we only met once or twice in the first 6 months, year that it was set up. But now, with the move to the Linux Foundation, we made a conscious decision to meet regularly and to see how that would work. And in general, I think it's worked pretty well. We've had lots of issues referred to us for discussion and to provide input. So every 2 weeks, more or less, we organize a meeting. It's held on IRC. The role of the chair for the meeting, who organizes the agenda and sends out the minutes afterwards, is rotation among the members in alphabetical order. Meeting agenda is published in advance of the dev mailing list, and then anybody can see that agenda, ask for things to be put on it, and can then sit in, so to speak, on IRC on the meeting and contribute. Obviously, only the technical board itself can vote if there's a vote on any issue, but the meetings are open to everybody to attend. And then the meeting minutes are published afterwards. We want this to be as transparent as possible. We've got nothing to hide in our technical board meetings. So that's about it, really, for a brief intro to the technical board. If I'm missing anything, guys, feel free to jump in just before we have the open discussion. There's some more information at these links here. I won't need to go through them. And now we're hoping to have a panel discussion where we get to discuss some technical issues that you guys care about. Here are some suggested topics. Have a look at this, because I'm planning on taking it away, because I don't want us to be the ones to suggest things we want to talk about. I think it should be you guys. Maybe we'll take the first one here to start the discussion, and thereafter we'll just look for audience questions, okay? For what are the issues that you see technically in DPDK that we should discuss. So the first one there is requirement for upstreaming a new API. So maybe we'll start with that as part of our open panel. Okay. So anything else? Any of the rest of you want to contribute before we start our open panel? Have I covered everything, you feel? They all got the slides ahead of time, so I'm hoping I've covered everything, because they could have spoken up before. Yeah?
Oh, you're perfect, Bruce.
As always, yeah. Okay, so one of the first things that was on that list there was maybe the contribution of new APIs to DPDK and new device types, the process we have for that. Is that worthy of discussion to start off with? Any thoughts or feelings? I mean, we don't currently have a documented policy on what's needed to get a new device type into DPDK, or at least I haven't found it in the contributors guide. And we have had a number being contributed recently. So what are the thoughts on that?
Do you want to talk about supporting a new device with new functions, or a whole new library? Because it's a different...
I suppose mainly the second one, if that's of interest to people, but it's certainly of interest to me. I mean, we have discussed this before when getting, we had crypto dev arriving in, event devs arriving in. They all went in a staging tree first. But also for new libraries, are we too slow on holding back, and should we make more use of the experimental tag, for instance, pulling things into DPDK? And I'd also say, for all this discussion, feel free to have audience participation as well. I think there's a number of mics that can be passed around for people in the audience to contribute. It just doesn't have to be a conversation amongst us up here at the top table. So if you have got something to say, please feel free to stick up your hand, be it with questions or comments. So sorry for that brief interruption. I forgot to mention it sooner. Yep.
Okay. I was wondering if anyone's considered actually switching to, I guess, a DPK light. Let me back up. The environment abstraction layer currently is all bundled in user space. And that restricts the use model, particularly when we move to virtualized environments. And so unbundling that and also restricting the feature set for the PMD in user space in a light form so that you have a more portable application with less reliance on the underlying hardware platform. Has anyone considered that before?
I'm not sure I fully understand where you're getting that. Are you saying to allow the DPDK components to not rely on EAL, or are you saying to have a lighter version of the EAL itself? Or
yeah, a lighter version in the application, and then in the global space that's managed through orchestration, actually have the resources allocated to the.
So this would be like a different EAL that just takes resources from an orchestrator. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, and have less conflict between instances. And that
Send us a patch and we'll look at it. Really, no, I mean, a lot of times people do speculative things, and if you just say speculatively, it would be cool if that's as far as it gets. If you come out with a concrete proposal, then people could say, that looks like this, and if it worked this way, it would make sense.
But it's not specifically something we have looked at, though there has been quite a bit of discussion, and I think there are a number of us kind of thinking about it and looking ways to make it happen, to make the EAL less prescriptive and to make DPDK, we've got to move DPDK away from being an all-encompassing framework that takes over all your cores and all your memory, and instead is just another library that you happen to use that provides assists that can help you with managing your threads and managing your memory. And we've taken baby steps in that direction. And I'm sure most of you have been aware, I've been looking at the build system for DPDK, and this is one of the things I'm trying to steer us towards as well in that work is, okay, let's just use the standard OS tools for it. Let's not assume everybody is just writing their app for DPDK and has to use the DPDK build system. We've got to now do the same thing for threads and for memory and maybe other stuff. You guys, any other comments?
Agree.
I have a kind of bigger picture, as I wish that we could personally get to a more user-driven rather than vendor-driven approach, because so often vendor has feature Y and they want to get that into DPDK, and we expand to accept feature Y, but we don't get the use case models coming down from the user, like I want to do a huge scale web server, and this is what this is, and this is how it would impact the threading model, because those are the harder ones. And I have a feeling like if all this is a way platform to show how you can use cool hardware, its scope will stay limited. If we could figure out how to expand into more use cases from users. And also, I think there's a lot of people that are using DPDK that aren't really contributing a lot back to it. And if we could figure out how to engage that community a little more, would be good too.
Yeah.
The problem with EAL is it does a lot of stuff in one function. EAL init does memory allocation. It does pthread creation.
PCI bus scanning.
Everything. So
well, we're ripping that out, right?
If an application wants to do only a sub-part of this, it is not possible because we don't have the API for that. So yes, I agree with something in the direction we should go.
And the other one sort of related to that is the whole configuration, devargs, what makes sense for, L3 forward test PMD doesn't make sense to integrate into a commercial application.
Yes, definitely. We are waiting some patches to split the EAL init, for sure. We know it's not the good way to do it. It comes from a long time where it was only bare metal things and something like that. There was no configuration possible. but now it's a standard library. We should be able to initialize just what we want. And I think the really good directions is to have one function for one thing, for one feature, you see. And definitely we should drop this argv initialization. It's just, yeah. And about argv, it's important to understand that EAL has a parsing library. So we propose some options, we parse them, and we call the right function to initialize what the options were. But you could propose a different way of initializing DPDK with your application. It can be a configuration file, it can be automatic, it can be, I don't know, a web request, or I don't care. So what we want at first is the right fine-grained API. And then we can propose some default parsing library for the most common options that every application wants. But again, it must be a choice of the application to use this parsing library. It's just a proposed default. That's the directions. And why it is not done? Because nobody did it.
Yeah, nobody cares because it works. It's not a feature that that application needs to have a good performance, or so it works like this. It's not very good, but we can do with that. So,
it would probably be good if we actually documented better the semantics of what goes on there, because my experience, there's been a lot of cases where, you know, things happen, files are opened, you get run in a different thread, and, you know, kind of like what are all the semantic things that happen between X and Y?
And in what order?
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff in there that if you don't do it in the right order, it breaks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit brittle. And,
which reminds me, what about my logging init patch that never got picked up?
I got to put it over that direction.
I discovered the hard way. You was trying to debug something where the bringing up the bus subsystem, the logging subsystem wasn't up yet.
Yeah, I think logging is one of the first things that whatever new approach is taken, it still needs to be available from the get-go in order to debug this.
I'm a little bit concerned as we grow and the complexity increases that we're going to create a huge amount of interdependencies that are not always obvious until you run into a problem.
Yeah.
And one of the ones that's pretty common is if you ever dealt with large C++ programs, is initializing order can be a real...
yeah, especially if we move more to constructors and we got not very well-defined initialization order. That's one thing, I suppose, about having EAL init in that one file is you can, if you're looking at the code, you can see, well, this gets init first, this gets init first.
But now we have constructor inits that are happening before that.
So that's, okay, broken the simplicity, but given us additional functionality. So it's natural complexity, shall we say, being added on through new functionality being added. I think it happens. And yeah, we have a problem with EAL, getting back to the original point, in that it is maybe a bit too all-encompassing. EAL init, I agree, probably needs to be simplified, or we need to think of replacements. On the plus side, I'm fairly positive about it. I mean, I've seen the work and the transitions that have gone over the last year or two, and now we've got the PCI stuff being taken out into separate bus infrastructure. So that's one less thing. That's part of that. EAL init, it's kind of pulled off to the side now. So there is hope, and I suspect it'll take a while, but I think we'll get there, would be my feelings on it. What exactly it looks like, I don't know. I haven't thought a lot about it. There's
related to initial comments about being user-driven, extending user-driven features. It's easy to be vendor-driven because vendor is providing patches. What can be ways to be user-driven?
What? Sorry, could you repeat?
There was a comment to be, instead of being vendor-driven, be user-driven. Expand DPDK in a ways for user needs. Okay, no?
Speak up is the best way. If you say, I'd like to do X and I can't do it because of Y, and you can write that out in a technical rationale, that could really get a long way. If nothing else, you'll get a short-term solution and a long-term solution. And people's memories tend to be long enough that they can say, oh, users really need this. We shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, I doubt it's a DBDK specific problem though.
No, I don't think so either. But unless users themselves start contributing, I don't know what, or question is, what can we do?
Well, I mean, you go the other way too. We had situations like, how long did it take us to pull out Zen? Because we don't have any knowledge about whether anybody's ever using it.
Yeah. Well, this is the point to plug the survey, which is one of the few tools we have to try and get, user feedback. So us as vendors, we'll provide some of our feedback, but we also need to push our users and anybody that we as developers know are our users who are signing with the community, point them at that survey so that we can get that information back as to, okay, what parts of DBDK are people really using as opposed to what parts we think people are using.
Because more important, what do they want to use it for?
That's true as well. That's even more so.
He's just holding up the mic looking like he wants something.
Go on, Keith. We'll brace ourselves.
All right. So I'm going to get back to EAL a little bit. So if you guys remember way back when, as EAL was broken up a little bit, okay?
That's good enough.
And the people got the orders out of, they screwed up the order of initialization because they didn't know which one to call first, right? So we pushed everything into EAL, which made it simple, but then it made it all one big mess. So what we need to do is break it back down into those individual components, but still have an EAL init for the people who need one. And the people who can actually call the pieces individually, let them call them individually. But put it in a nice, put those calls in that one file or that one function and do it. But the real thing I think we need to focus on is memory allocation and how it's divvied out today, right? We did a lot of work in memory allocation. Right now it's super slow for startups on some of these systems with large amounts of huge pages. We need to fix that. Unfortunately, part of it's in the kernel. The kernel, I think, is zeroing memory, so that's going to be a pain. But we need to figure out how to solve that one, and we need to figure out how to make it more usable by people as to select a certain amount of memory, and that's all DBDK ever gets. It doesn't try to allocate anymore. And one of the side effects of DBDK today is that you can still call malloc and grab as much memory as you want, but the EAL init or mallocs are fixed, which is good, but it needs to be more dynamic. So I know we've looked at it or talked about it. Do you guys know of anybody that's working on trying to fix that problem yet? I mean, I asked 2 questions, but.
Your question is about the time to initialize memory?
Yeah, right now it's, to basically initialize DBDK, it's going to take, on some systems, somebody's reporting 12 minutes, because they have 128 gigabytes of huge pages. And right now we've actually increased, probably doubled, at least in my little test for DBDK, we've doubled the initial startup time for DBDK for package-in by adding in the NUMA awareness stuff. So we've kind of screwed that one a little bit. So we have to figure out how to fix that.
First answer is that it takes time at initialization, but then it is performant because everything is initialized at the beginning. But I agree, it's too long. I agree. And maybe we don't need so many memory. I mean, we are using huge pages for everything. And sometimes applications don't need these huge pages. I think probably the good work would be to classify which kind of memory we have and we want. Do we want a memory which is for DMA, so with a fixed physical address? Do we want big pages? Do we want some contiguous memory? This kind of thing. So it's a matter of classification, and then we initialize only what we need.
Well, yeah, there's no reason that the huge page pool can't, the part that's used could grow as needed. The other thing is that the initial style, probably left over from what was on bare metal, is to basically just use huge pages as if it was bare metal memory. And that's actually really bad in an OS environment. I mean, as Thomas was saying, you want to reduce it down to places where you need pinned memory for DMA, or you're sharing memory between two processes. For everything else, there really shouldn't be a big gain with a properly functioning OS.
Today, I think it's one of our bigger problems is memory allocation and how we deal with memory. And we need to figure out how to solve that. The initialization stuff, that's kind of a side effect, I guess.
Right.
Now, I don't mind the argv-argc command line stuff, but it's becoming very complex now. I would like to see us move to something else.
Well,
for initialization file,
Thomas
that's a different problem.
talked about even a while ago getting rid of huge pages altogether and just using mmap and pinned memory.
Yeah, that could work.
Especially with transparent huge pages now, it becomes a lot less of an issue.
Yeah, one of the problems is I think the kernel is zeroing the huge pages as you allocate them, so you have to be careful.
Right, but if you didn't do that,
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing I see as being an easy way to improve things would be to add to DPDK. I know we're kind of increasing the scope of the problem potentially by adding, but it should be fairly easy to add in to DPDK functions for saying add a core, remove a core from EAL, and functions add this block of memory to DPDK. And that way you can have an application that says, well, just start up with 1 2 meg huge page. Okay, if it requires huge pages, well, we just give it 1 to start off with, and thereafter the application then controls the allocation of memory. If it want to use 1 gig pages, the application can allocate them themselves and then say, right, DPDK, you use this, you use that, you use 4K pin memory, you use just regular malloc memory. So if we just add in a hook to say, look, here's some additional memory, here's some additional cores you can use, then we're passing control back to the application and allowing greater options. And that shouldn't be a big lift. That's not affecting that many other parts of DPDK. Though it does, the one wrinkle there is we need to give DPDK greater awareness of pinned versus unpinned memory, or memory that is physically contiguous and non-physically contiguous. So there may be a couple of wrinkles there, but it's doable, especially if we've got systems where we're using something like VFIO. Because if we can program the IOMMU, we can make any memory look like a contiguous block of physical memory, which makes things nice and easy. It's the non-IOMMU cases that are a bit more problematic, but even then I think it's solvable. There's not that many cases other than DMA that needs that physical address and that physical contiguous block.
I like that when you deal with guests who have expanding memory ballooning going on. So you don't want to do the Java thing of grab all memory that's existing on the system in one fell swoop.
Yeah.
I think basically said most of what I was going to say anyway, but I was wondering, would it be possible to have more context-aware DPDK so that I know if I'm running inside a VM, there's no reason to look for physically contiguous memory anyway, because I'm running inside a VM. I could look for something that looks physically contiguous, but it's not going to be physically contiguous because because of the way the virtual machine maps the memory. Similarly, if I'm using only software, if I'm using only soft interfaces between, let's say, I'm using something like virt.io user to talk between a container and the DPDK in the backend. Again, I don't need that. I don't need physically contiguous memory for that. So would it be possible to have a more context-aware DPDK so that it understands the context in which it's running?
Right?
I'm sure everything's possible. The question I'd throw back is, do we really need that level of context awareness, or do we just need the actual underlying objects and drivers to be a bit more specific as to what they require? So if you're using a virtual driver that doesn't actually access hardware, it shouldn't be requesting memory that's physically pinned and that has a physical address, whereas a hardware driver does need that with a physical address. And whenever you're creating a mempool, we shouldn't need the whole memory pool to be physically contiguous anymore.
Well, we have this backwards initialization right now where you have to guess what mempool you should give to the NIC before you...
Yeah.
I mean, you may want to switch that around at some point and say, well, if you don't give me a mempool, I'll make my own with what I want, and then gradually...
Yeah, I'm sure there's various ways to accomplish it, but I think rather than having it the outside environment being queried and being looked at by the DPDK initialization. I think the actual underlying objects in DPDK should report out themselves saying, I need physically contiguous memory, I need pin memory, or I frankly don't care what kind of memory I need at all. And thereafter, if you're running in a container environment using a virt.io that doesn't need physically contiguous memory, it doesn't use it, not because you're running in a container, but because the objects you're using it inside that don't require it. Because if you're running in a container, you could still use SRIOV, which would need that physical memory. So it's not the nature of the container, it's the nature of the interfaces you're using. And we don't have that path for passing that awareness back. Is there some work being done on that? I saw the default mempools. That's kind of a step in that direction for the
well, don't you
SLCs?
don't you need a bit of both? Because certainly if I'm running inside a VM, there's no reason to search for physically contiguous memory inside a VM, right?
Well, there would be.
Well, the VM is going to tell you it's physically contiguous, but it may, not be in actual fact. So what's the point, right?
Well, because if it's not even running in, this is getting really technical, but even if you're running inside a VM and you're trying to have DMA from SRIOV device of, let's say, a 9K jumbo frame, inside the guest physical address space, you still need that 9K guest physically contiguous. So from the VM's point of view, it still needs to be contiguous. But we can discuss this after, Ray. I know it's not really going to be, but from the guest point of view, I think through the way the IOMMU is programmed, it's still going to have to be. But that's a really low-level technical discussion. I'll argue with Ray about it later.
But yes, we are back on what Thomas said. We first need classification, identifying in drivers, in libraries, what kind of memory is needed. And after, we need in EAL a way to request a different kind of memory. Huge pages have other good properties. They are locked in memory. So when you access it, there are never any page fault. And this is very important in the context of DPDK, because if you have a page fault, you are in kernel and you are blocked. Your application does not poll the packets anymore. And if you are managing hundreds of millions of packets per second, it can be dramatic. You will lose packets. Also, having huge pages avoids the TLB miss, reduce the risk of TLB miss. So again, it reduces the risk of blocking. So your question about mempool, yes. So today, since maybe 1607, mempool is able to request memory and work with memory which is not physically contiguous. Only some blocks will be contiguous. The requirement is each object
needs to be contiguous with it, which is a fairly reasonable requirement if we assume that we're going to have DMA to part of a mempool.
It's a requirement for hardware drivers, but it shouldn't be a requirement for virtual driver.
Yeah, we just need a way of passing that information back, because, as you said, the mempool is created first before you start setting up the drivers to use that memory pool. So it is a bit of a it's done.
Well, then the other thing is you get a situation where packets arrive on one driver, they come in a mempool and then get passed to another driver, so that there's no real consistency or requirement that they all be off the same mempool.
Yeah. So, but the advantage of the current scheme is it is handing it under the control, keeping it under the control of the application. The application should know if it's going to be using interfaces that need physical addresses and pin memory, so it can set up the mempool in such a way that it has that, even if the first interface for RX, which is the one tied to that mempool, doesn't actually require it. It knows that later on it'll have it. So I think having it under control of the application is a reasonable way to have it for now, though it may not be perfect.
Let me ask a meta question. You created a complex system here with a lot of semantics. How well documented? Is it documented well enough that users are able to pick it up and go forward with it? Or are we, I don't want this to become a cult of DPDK that only certain users know what goes on.
Magic incantations.
I see a lot of questions on the user list that imply that there's a lot of special semantics that either aren't documented or are hard to understand. Back there, there's a question, a hand up.
I think a couple of years ago, when DPDK was pretty basic and primarily PMDs and maybe some table lookup functions, the documentation was sufficient because the set of libraries was low. And so it's easy to understand, if I want to do this, I need to do this, this, and that. And for instance, some of the more complex things, like if you have multiple processes in your OS, how do you do that with DPDK? Because there's a lot of cross requirements, especially related to memory.
Yep.
So as the complexity grows, the documentation also needs to explain more and more, why do I need to initialize in this order, and how does this interact with that? If I spin up a new process, for instance, in the OS, how do I attach that to the DPDK memory, for instance? Just as an example. So as the complexity grows, the documentation also needs to explain more what's going on inside DPDK. Also, a lot earlier in the presentation today, you said that you were trying to move DPDK more away from being a framework towards being a library. And I'm sometimes when new features are suggested, I objected to the mailing list that this should not be implemented as a hook. This should be implemented as a library function that the application can call if it needs to. So maybe some of the people that are deeply involved in DPDK 24/7, or at least 40 hours per week or whatever, they more tend to integrate things more than perhaps they need to be. So I think it's a good trend, moving more towards library or a set of libraries. Or, well, we use it in a box, in an appliance box. So we only take the things that we need,
right.
And we don't need it to be generic. We need it to be fast and efficient for our application. So all the tight integration of things that we don't use, it's just things we don't need. So keep it more separate. So it's 2 more comments. Yeah.
One of the comment I received yesterday in one of the governing board meeting, that there was a complaint that we are changing the API too frequently.
Yeah, just every release only. Right? Has there been a release yet that hasn't actually had API notices for the future one?
I actually was thinking last night, has anyone successfully ever even tried to run an API compatibility between releases in a real product?
Open
Or do
question
you
for the
just say,
audience.
well, I'm going to have to plan to go to a new release in 3 months anyway, and I'll just bite the bullet? And
Well, we'll let somebody from Red Hat comment, I think.
No, just I suppose a general question. You touched on API and ABI. I think we'll have a discussion tomorrow. But I suppose I hear a lot about what we put in new to DPDK and how we'll change it. But on the flip side, how to provide that, or how do you think we should provide that stability to users? I know myself and Bruce, we talked about build system. We also saw some hardware deprecation of some older hardware this year. There's talk on the mailing list of some older kernels being deprecated. So, while some people might be watching the dev mailing list and catch these things, how do you think we should provide a kind of a more stable DPDK that users can see well in advance and have time to, I suppose, be more involved in the discussion about deprecation? And so just wondering what your thoughts on that are.
It's hard.
it's really hard because we get things where we goofed initially and things aren't big enough. The other one, we've had a lot of problems where 2 components of the DPDK are exposing internals to the outside world. They need to change the internals. So technically we're changing the ABI, but if only it's driver part X to talking to library part Y, and you never would use the two from different versions anyway, you know.
Yeah. And okay, we didn't make things, we didn't have things big enough. Well, why don't we make everything big to start with? Well, then that impacts performance. And the same with, why don't you hide all the internals so that you can do this easier? Well, that also impacts performance. So,
hide it by having one combined library versus breaking it up into sub-libraries, a lot of really hard trade-offs.
Yeah.
Sometimes people ask, but why DPDK is not like other libraries? Why it is not more standard with the stable APIs and things like that? But there is something special in DPDK. It's not like other libraries. We are really focusing on performances on every cycles. So we cannot have a big abstraction layer. And every time we find a new way to gain some new cycles, we will do it, even if we have to break something.
Yes, but that doesn't mean we are not doing efforts to try, when possible, to have a stable API and to have a compat layers. I think since 1 or 2 years we are progressing on that topic, even if there is still some margin to progress.
I think there's a full discussion on ABI stuff later on, so maybe we shouldn't rattle on it here. But I'm not sure there's an easy answer, though. Open to suggestions.
I guess there needs to be a balance because, obviously devs will be very interested in getting those extra cycles and putting new stuff in and making the software actually better. But from a user perspective, maybe better is having kind of more stability.
Right.
Maybe one suggestion is the deprecation process. Once it's in the docs, the decision is made. It's just a notice that it's going to change. Maybe we should look at putting it in the docs for a release to say, or putting it up on the website. Big kind of flashing letters. This hardware will be deprecated, or this will change in an upcoming release.
It is exactly a question of technical direction of the project. We must know if we prefer to favoritize the user experience, or if we prefer to focus really on performance for every cycles. And that's why everybody should fill the survey, because there is one question for that. We have added a question about, do you prefer good performance? It means good performance compared to what you have with kernel. Or do you want the best performance, where every cycle counts? And it's difficult to take this decision. I think for now the consensus is we are trying to get every cycles. But if the user feedback, if the survey feedback says the contrary, we can change our mind.
Since it has been mentioned about deprecation notice, we are maintaining a deprecation notice documentation. That's just a heads up for one release before. I just wonder if it is working and if people are really reading it and preparing for next incoming changes. Is it working? Because we are spending effort to maintain deprecation notices.
Environment, because unfortunately we don't have a choice. We have to deal with different versions of the SDK, and when you deprecate things, that means the application actually has to call. And then the other thing is that you switch and add arguments and new enums and things like that. And so even though it's essentially the same API, and often the defaults are null, it does mean you've got to have if-defs in order to cover the different versions. And so the complication is more in the application rather than, because you moved to the new SDK and you just have all these broken build elements that you have to go back and repair. But if you have an application that you want to support, a lot of people freeze on different versions of the SDK. And so if you have an application where you want to support, again, this is user feedback, but if you have an application that needs to support various SDKs essentially, then that's what you end up doing is, you know, a lot of if-defs.
We are doing this at Sixwin, supporting several DPDK versions. It is quite painful, but it is doable. But
I thought one of the John, you need to go first? Go ahead. Okay, so one of the things I was thinking about, I thought the LTSs are really our frozen APIs per se. Is that not the case? Are people actually taking the interim releases and trying to make those work as well, or? Yeah. Okay. So I mean, so is it so does the LTS help at all for people?
It's a good discussion, but I think we will have it tomorrow, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Probably it's better to wait tomorrow. I don't want to.
I don't know if it's on the agenda tomorrow, but is anybody actually using DPDK from a distribution rather than doing a roll your own? Because, I mean, in a lot of other software projects, there's an intermediate layer and somebody else is dealing with that issue rather than...
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of people using it from distributions.
No, but the users are, different communities. So you have Open vSwitch, you have VPP, you have other vSwitches, and they have lifecycle, and all of them, they are integrated in a stack. So like we talk about OpenStack for telco, but by the time you have a DPDK, then you have OVS that can consume it, and then we have an OVS, we have an OVS DPDK, and then we bring it to customer. They take like 2 years of testing, and then, okay, they're ready to go. And by then, who will support? And they say, okay, I've got a new cool NIC, and I cannot use it. So the real thing is, we talk about the feature and the cycles that you can gain and stuff, but at the end, on a 2-year-old DPDK, people want the brand new hardware. So if you can bring that in the LTS and bring new NIC support, that bring a lot of value to end user because their pace of deployment is very different from the developer pace.
Yeah, but there's a difference between bringing a new NIC into an LTS release and bringing a new NIC in that happens to decide to have 6 new offload flags that now bumped it up to 64 bits that created an API breakage. I mean, so there's a question of, do you want VXLAN offload on that new NIC, or you just want it to send and receive packets like your old LTS one did?
Is scope of LTS, is that covered in the API discussion as well? It is too. Okay, so remember those points again, to bring them up.
So I have a question, yeah. Just before that, just on the documentation, which was mentioned earlier, I'm still the documentation maintainer. And the documentation can always be improved, definitely. And I think you're right in terms of, I think the DPK documentation is not bad overall. There's plenty of it there, but the quality could definitely be improved. But we need people to submit those patches to improve it, or just to highlight where they think it's wrong. Maybe if they find some part hard, and that could be improved, but they don't really know how to write that particular part of the document again. We just need to know that, where people are struggling. And there may be a way that we find out soon, that a way of highlighting that via a bug tracker or something like that. But either, submit patches for the documentation, just push them up there, or let us know where you think it's broken and we can fix that. My question is just around APIs. I think there's a lot of new APIs have come in the last few releases. And I think the benefit, especially something like RT Flow, benefit very much from being put out into the community and getting a lot of different feedback and kind of a lot of kind of iterations. I think it took us 2 releases to kind of get it right before it started going in. And I think there's value in getting those APIs up there early, and we see RFCs and whatever. In certain cases, we're kind of blocked where we don't have hardware to go with the API. So at the moment, I think there's a rule, either implicit or explicit, that says an API can't go into the APDK if there isn't hardware there for it, which is the case, right? So is there a case for accepting APIs into DPDK under an experimental tag or otherwise that support hardware that isn't available yet? And we all have cases, I mean, there's all vendors here that understand that you have hardware that's in pre-production or it's under NDA. It just, you know, you can't buy it off the shelf just yet. But at the same time, it's useful to have the APIs out there because, you know, we can have those discussions about where this is going. So does the tech board have a view on that? I guess my question is, what is the status quo now? What is our current position? And is that the position that we should be maintaining going forward?
Okay, could you summarize your question? So, is there opposition about bringing a new NIC in a stable release? No.
So my question is it okay to have an API for hardware that isn't available?
In which context? In the head or in the?
Yeah.
A new API. I don't understand.
So, if we wanted to have an API for an offload
yes.
to an FPGA, but you don't have a publicly available FPGA, for example, I think currently there is a rule, right, that you can't have APIs that support hardware that doesn't exist, right, or that isn't publicly available.
So you want to use a library which is not available?
No, it's more like suppose they had some magic secret sauce, Nick, that was coming out in a year, but they had the APIs done and they wanted to get people to use them. The problem is more that what's the chance that gets delayed, gets broken, you decide to change the APIs, and we certainly don't want to be ABI compatible issues for things that were later changed, removed, specs changed. I mean, I guess that whether it's upstream or whether it's in another tree, you're probably better off to just have it in another tree and carry it there till you're really ready. We don't have to have everything in the main code base that's being used by distros and users. I mean, there can be publicly available trees that have features that aren't in the mainline. I mean,
there are some APIs that you could have as experimental, which means they're not governed by ABI, right? In the main tree. And what you're really trying to do is get people to utilize it, improve it, make it better until the hardware shows up and make sure everybody else's hardware will also work with it. That's what I'm
I also think that anybody would be obviously say yes if you have two vendors that are both going to do the same kind of offload, and this is a way for them to work together. I mean,
yeah, could I add one quick comment? And I guess, John, what you're kind of poking at is what is the bar for a new API? And is software equivalence good enough? So if you have a software implementation, take CryptoDev where you can run it in software versus having that hardware. Software seems to make sense, I think, as that point where you could still use it and get benefit from it, and at some stage later then intercept with whatever.
I personally would think it would be okay as long as, but it probably would need the experimental tag initially, because there may be still some doubt about it, some changes, and we don't want the ABI breaks.
I think it makes sense, like if you have more than one user for a particular API, rather than having it just vendor-specific API.
So,
though if it's experimental, does it still need multiple users?
Not as much.
Certainly to become, fixed. You need multiple implementations, right? But for experimental, would shouldn't be for me a bit of a grayer area.
I suppose then you're saying that the bar for mainline is hardware then?
No, is it usable? And I guess usable means software or hardware.
Okay, I just want
to. I don't want to be carrying dead code. I don't think that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree.
Or code what's worse, it's the wrong stuff, and then you're trying to change it in.
Thanks.
I have partly a continuation of this discussion. The roadmap for DPDK looks like the roadmap for the next iPhone. You will know what's in there when it's revealed. The roadmap goes to current version and 1 or 2 items in the next version. Could you, as a tech board, consider a long-term roadmap with some high-level stuff that might be interesting? And the roadmap can be modified. It's not set in stone. It's just, this is kind of the things that would be nice to get into DPDK within the next year or so, which would also maybe open up for people having features coming out in their products in a few years or in a year or something, or leave room for that somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't view that really so much as a roadmap as more of an aspirational wish list. I mean, if you're talking about stuff like we've talked about, I presume, you know, reworking, changing some of the aspects of the memory system and all, without a definite commitment from a particular individual or individuals to upstream patches, I'd find it hard to see that going on a definite roadmap, because it's not like anybody can schedule their product based on that being available. But it probably wouldn't hurt to have known gaps or, as they say, aspirational wish list out there for things that, okay, if people really want to get stuck into the depths of DPDK, here's some stuff you could look at. Is a roadmap the best way for that? The other alternative is you have something like that as using the defect tracker as well. Might be where some of this stuff gets put to, because there are limitations as well. They are kind of bugs. Whether they're bugs or major changes, gray area, but they're, yeah, kind of contradicting myself.
It's really a hard thing to do because, A, nobody wants to make a commitment for the future on something that may or may not be done because they don't have they're not guaranteed resources. The other one is the tech board. We don't want to say no to somebody that shows up with something cool tomorrow because it's not on the roadmap.
No, that's yeah,
well,
so
no, there's some projects that have that kind of mentality, and we don't want to have that mentality. If somebody says, I came in with a FrostBoss hardware device and it does all those things, it works great in the DPDK.
Great.
Yeah, so maybe Bruce's point of being, instead of having a long-term roadmap, just having a list of areas of interest or directions or something that, so we can see a bit farther into the future where's DPDK
yeah, the thing is, we put it up there, it's not guaranteed it's coming.
Had come out with some of those before. I haven't seen one recently.
But I don't think that's just a responsibility for the tech board. I think that's a responsibility for the community. So for the last 2 or 3, 4 summits, every time we go to a summit, we request companies, participants to publicly push out what their roadmap onto the list and show and demonstrate what people are doing. And if you look at 1802, I'd say there's 3 or 4 features there. So it's not just the tech board. I think there's a responsibility on the entire community to publish up in advance what they're planning to deliver. They don't have to go into NDA details, but just to release a bit more information of what they're planning to do. Because we've also seen instances where there's been duplicated work because people are not aware that somebody else is working in similar way.
I think, yes, I agree, and I think the key word is the fear of commitment here, that if we can have something this is not committed, nobody commits to this is just things that might go into DPDK or directions it might take. And that would also help duplicate work, probably.
And one additional thing I might add to that might also be, if you're looking in this area, talk to. You know, because, okay, there's obviously be the maintainers, but if somebody is possibly thinking about this or doing some early prototyping, again, without commitment, if somebody else is going to come in and look at that, maybe you might want to say, look, you might want to talk to this person first, and they've already done some work in this area. Again, it might be something that could be worth having if you're looking at that more bigger tasks, more aspirational changes, rather than, well, we're going to deliver this in the next release and this release after, which is obviously needed as well for people planning products based on DPDK.
Yeah. First of all, it's important to explain the process. When you want a new feature, you talk about it on the dev mailing list. And when you want to add something in the roadmap is just a page on the website. So you just have to send the patch to the web mailing list, and it can be accepted. But usually it's better to discuss first what you want to do, and then if it's technically accepted, we can put it on the roadmap. That's the first thing. Then until now, the roadmap is filled mainly by Intel, by Mellanox, by other vendors for some features. And it was at first it was just to allow everyone to know what is going to be done in the next release or the next one, so we can avoid duplicated effort. But now there is a new section on this roadmap. I think it is called Future or something like that. And probably we can use it to put what we would like and what was accepted as a good direction by the technical board, even if we don't plan to do it. If we say, okay, it's a good direction, we should do it, we can just write it on the roadmap, and maybe, hopefully, someone will do it. But for sure, the roadmap is not a way to ask someone to do your work, for sure. It's just a way to show what is the direction, what is accepted.
Yeah, perhaps we do need to flag some way on our roadmap the rework that needs to be done more so than new features, because it is mostly rework I think we'd be looking at here. So, I mean, the bus rework and pulling out PCI bus and VDEV bus, was that reported on the roadmaps? And if we're looking at memory rework, you know, more dynamism in core management and whatever other rework is being looked at, you know, we could put a page in for that. For
Bugzilla would be a good place for that?
Yeah, it's not
really.
No. Yeah. That was my thought as well, but thinking about it more, it's not as public.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it wouldn't be immediately reflected on the website.
Well, actually, the ideal thing would be figure out a way to put it on the website.
Yeah.
I agree. It seems to be a process thing that the standard response, I heard the response from you guys a couple of times. Yeah, great, send the patch and we'll consider something. So maybe, so that makes it very, again, vendor-driven rather than user-driven. So maybe some sort of feature wish list or something.
Yeah.
A lot of companies that sell software as a service and so on, they have a support side or something where you can, also Microsoft has the feedback hub or whatever, where you can, as an end user, submit, this is an error or this is a feature I want. Something like that that's public and easy for the end users to use, and not something that you need to follow 1,000 emails per month mailing list to.
But we need to discuss the proposal, the wish list. And for now, we have one tool for discussions. It is emails. So I don't know. Do you think it's a barrier for users to post email to ask questions?
It's not a barrier to submit an email to ask questions. It's a barrier that the email, the developer mailing list is, I think I have 12,000 unread mails in the developer mailing list right now. I can't keep up with that. Because I'm not so active in the development of the DPDK, so I can keep up with that.
Okay,
And that also makes me unavailable to keep up with what's the things that are being considered. So if I look at something that would be considered, I would probably search for that or read through the emails, scan through the emails quickly, but it doesn't give me any kind of overview of what's going on.
I was thinking maybe we can have another tool, like for instance, like Stack Overflow questions, or I don't know, something like that. So something to sort and order the user's feedback. But again, it is a risk to have a lot of requests, and it will be the same thing as a full inbox. I don't know. I really don't know. It's a question about tooling. What is the best tool?
I agree, but I think, so what I'm suggesting is we need something that's maybe between the roadmap, because the roadmap is committed and things that will definitely get done, and somebody already submitted as patch or something RFC And then there's at the other end of the scale, there's the mailing list, and there's nothing.
Actually,
in between.
there's also what's really missing is a wish list, where somebody has an aspirational need and they don't have a way to record that.
Yes, and it needs to be really easily accessible for end users that go to the DPDK website or something to see what's high-level things.
And a lot of those go beyond just the technology that's right in the DPDK right now. It may go back to hardware infrastructure. It may go back to host infrastructure. It may go back even to kernel infrastructure.
Yeah.
To get those kind of things.
So we've got 1 minute left.
Blow the last question on 1 minute, but there's also a patchwork site, which is where all the work is occurring. Look there for a wish list or what's happening.
Put it in patchwork, yeah.
Or maybe it could be just a standing agenda item in your tech board is to have one line at the end for wish list items, and you start to build those up over time so that people just have to look at the minutes from the meeting and start to see a wish list of items that's coming into the tech board. So one suggestion.
So is this last question? Pablo there at the back, I think.
It's just a comment. So OpenStack project, when they want a feature, I mean the open source project, so they have blueprints. So people, they write blueprints, and people, they review the blueprints. So you have blueprint review, and then they agree, and then you have a whole process behind. So you like it, you don't like it, but at the end, as the blueprint is submitted with Gerrit, so it's like a piece of code, you know, and you have the whole review pipeline. And when you have enough +2 and it's agreed, okay, so we are going to try to implement it for next release or the next one, you know. And we have some blueprints which are evolving over time. So you have the commit log on the blueprint, so you know what was the initial proposal. And this is how people provide their wish list. And at least the user, they have to describe what they want, not how to do it. So I think the blueprint worth giving a look.
But it is moving the discussion elsewhere, so it will be out of our radar. I mean, who will look the blueprints? Only the author and few people.
The blueprint are the tech lead of the project. So
and when someone is discussing this blueprint, most of people don't see the discussion. We don't see. We even don't see that there is a discussion. You see, with email, probably you don't read every email, but you see there is an email. You see the title. Oh, something happens there.
Yeah,
okay?
but at least you have a query system when you can see all of the blueprint which are approved for the next release and stuff. You know, it's like making a Bugzilla query, or every time you have a commit log, you look at all the commit log. It depends. It's it's a push-pull question.
Yeah, Keith is proposing to add tags, so it means people must be aware that they have to put tags. Yeah. That's the other proposal could be to add a new mailing list. I don't know, one more.
Okay. Okay. Very last question.
Yeah, just last question. So it's mainly about subtrees and specifically maintainers. So now that we have the number of subtrees are growing, and actually I think that's great. I think it's taking off pressure from you, Thomas. Actually, very nice work. So now we have one maintainer per subtree, and actually the one for crypto. Now we're going to have two maintainers for the whole DPDK repository, right? The mainline. Do you think that there is value in adding a new, a co-maintainer or backup maintainer for subtrees as well? And actually, what is better, co-maintaining or have a backup maintainer but always have a primary maintainer?
Whatever gets the patches in.
As long as you can agree, I don't really think that it's a problem. The only question is how do you deal with conflict resolution? I mean, I know, for example, the Linux Bluetooth tree had 4 maintainers, and the rule was, main maintainer couldn't put in his own patch unless another maintainer acted, and any one of them could object to it.
If you are co-maintaining, if both agree, it's fine. But once there is some, discussion, probably you need sort of discussion, maybe not necessarily weekly, but communication between those two maintainers, right?
It all comes down to cooperation and trust.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Definitely echo that. That it's really just a matter of coordination. It can be done, and we have examples, and it should be done if you can rope in some volunteers, Pablo. So thanks very much to the Tech Board. Good discussion. The Governing Board will be starting in approximately 15 minutes at 1:45, so it's a chance to have a break and for the people to get unmiked so the next group can get mic'd up. Maybe there's some overlap a little bit. So break for coffee for 15 minutes, we'll start back with the Governing Board.
Right.